Hello everybody, Builder Guy here, and welcome back to the channel. A new Victoria 3 Dev Diary number 30. We're going to talk about the user interface today. Last Dev Diary was about the user experience. Now it's the UI, which is of course very important when it comes to figuring out where everything is. So, and thank you again for everybody that did watch that last Dev Diary. I know, again, it's not the most exciting in terms of game mechanics, but I do believe the UX and UI design is probably as important as the mechanics, because if the experience and the interface and how everything connects and flows isn't spot on, then the mechanics really just don't matter. Let me know your thoughts on UI, UX. How forgiving are you when it comes to UI and UX design? And if you don't mind, while you're leaving a comment, to hit that like button. So, off we go. My name is Kenneth, and I am the 2D art lead on Victoria 3. Working on the game's user interface with my team is a big part of what I do on the game. From here on, whenever the word UI is mentioned, it refers to an overview of these three categories: panels, buttons, and icons, which make up the UI of the game. Okay, so the majority of the information, the decisions a player makes, happens in the UI. There's a huge opportunity to engage and immerse the player in the world of Victoria 3 through the UI. As mentioned in the previous Dev Diary, the UX team's focus is to make this massive amount of information approachable and accessible. Us, in the UI team, work extremely closely with them to display all that information in a visually appealing way. So, art pillars and how it ties with UI. We have three core pillars in Victoria 3's art style. These pillars guide the overall art direction and capture the feelings we want to convey in the game, which includes, of course, the UI. Prestigious. The UI is inspired by the extravagance and luxuries of the upper class in the Victorian era. It should feel elegant and exquisite. Vintage and idyllic. Vintage here means something from the past that is of high quality. The Romanticism art movement is a source of inspiration for the art direction. It seems fitting given that it originated in the 1800s, and the idealization of the idyllic past and nature fits in nicely with the vintage feel that we want to incorporate in the UI. Detailed yet approachable. High level of detail with intricate elements, but used sparingly so it does not become cluttered and overwhelming. UI panel. UI panels form the base or background of every single UI menu, be it full screen, pop-ups, or on the sides in the game. If it is not on the map, it's on an UI panel. We chose to incorporate Art Nouveau elements into the panels. Art Nouveau is primarily inspired by nature and the natural forms and curves of plants and flowers. This aligns with the art pillar vintage and idyllic. The style is also prominent in the architecture of the upper echelons of society in the 1800s. Its intricate details evoke a feeling of extravagance and elegance, which aligns with the other two art pillars. We need to be careful not to put in too many detailed patterns, as this will distract the main function of an UI, which is to display information to the player. Hence, we focus the rich details on frames and borders of the panels, as well as headers, where the title of the menu resides. Okay, let's take a look. This is a UI panel. Elaborate patterns with a touch of gold and faded fabric textures adds that extra layer of prestige and vintage feel prominent in the Victorian era. Yes, you can see that here. Fabric, texture, the gold. It all works. It all looks very appealing and easy to read or easily readable, which for me is always very important. Buttons. Buttons are the main elements in the game and the UI that the player interacts directly with. From the UX point of view, players would need to identify the buttons almost instantaneously. Buttons should be identified either as navigation buttons, buttons that lead you to another UI screen, or action buttons, buttons that perform an action that affects the game world. With that in mind, we sought to create a template for the game's buttons while aligning it with our core art pillars. We use wood as a texture for the buttons for the aged vintage feel. All buttons have an emerald color with two different shades to differentiate between action and navigation buttons. Different shades of emerald for the buttons. Action buttons also have a thin gold border to differentiate them further while still having both types recognized as buttons. Okay, so you can see this one here. So this would be the navigation button. It's very clear. It's more a blue color. Versus the action button is this green with the gold around it. There would be some UI screens that would have multiple buttons on them. How can we draw attention to higher priority buttons? Our solution, give them more prestigious look by adding Art Nouveau elements around the borders and corners of the button. So here you can clearly see the difference between this action button here, slight gold trim around it, and then here it's way more elaborate. I personally believe that what would also help this would be if the text was in all caps. That makes it very, very clear. Icons. Icons are a major part of the UI in Paradox games, and of course, this is no different in Victoria 3. Icons in the game come in a wide variety of shapes, sizes, styles, and colors, and we use them to represent a host of different things, mechanics, statistics, and attributes in the game. I'll break down some of the different ways in which we use the icons, and hopefully y'all will gain a better insight into our design. I like that little y'all right there. Buildings and goods. This group of icons are by far the most visual and detailed in the game. They are representations of actual things in the game world. These icons are akin to mini illustrations. Their primary purpose is to enhance immersion and fuel the imagination of our players. Agriculture, fishing, coffee plantations, fabrics here. This would be whaling, actually. And then we've got scholarly activities, university, and so on. And then here we've got bread, furniture, cars, ships, and wood for different goods. Events, technologies, and pop-ups. Academia and dynamite are both technologies that a player can research, but one seems to be a little abstract, while dynamite is an actual object in real life. How then do we approach such icons as a group? For technology and event icons, we decided to use objects from the real world or several objects to represent them. Since most of these icons are going to be pretty big for an icon, we decided to go for a highly detailed and realistic rendering to enhance immersion. It is pretty straightforward for a technology like dynamite, but protest events, we use something a little more symbolic, like a hand-holding loudhailer. So this right here, loudhailer. Okay, I mean, it looks good. It'll just come down to what it actually looks like on screen. I mean, that's really what this will all come down to, is when we actually play the game, how easily recognizable and how large are these icons. Pop groups are represented by our amazing character models and icons. Since the character models will be a tad hard to see when scaled down, we use icons to support them. The same guidelines apply when designing pop icons. For example, machinists are represented by a wrench. Makes sense. The final group of icons I'm going to talk about is a broad group which represents game mechanics, their categories, attributes, and stats. These icons tend to show up in multiple different UI screens and are not very big for an icon. They may need to appear in different sizes as well. Many of them would need to be recognizable when they are small. Therefore, we reduce the amount of details on these icons drastically and instead focus on a few choice colors in the silhouettes. Battalions appear in many different UI screens in a variety of sizes. Okay, here you can see them. I like the large icon. It just makes it easier to see. Even though I have good eyesight, it's still easier to see. We can also use color coding on these icons to make them more recognizable. For example, we have positive condition icons being green and negative condition icons being red. Of course, if you're green-red colorblind, this isn't great, but they talked about it in the UX design dev diary that I covered, that they're going to make them more accessible for people that are colorblind. Because if you are green-red colorblind, this does nothing for you. Interest groups. Icons are a more complex example of color coding. Players may not immediately remember and understand all the color coding within each subcategory of icons, but our hope is that this will get more familiar and identifiable over time. Other examples of this are the lens category icons. So you got the lenses here. Those are relatively easy to discern. The interest group icons, we'll just have to get used to it over time. Tutorial. In the previous dev diary, Aaron and Henrik have briefly mentioned the tutorial. I'm going to talk a little about the art that goes into helping players understand our incredibly deep and complex mechanics better. We believe that the combination of tooltips, text explanations, and infographics will help visualize the game mechanics better. Most infographics you find online, go ahead, do a Google search, have a clean, stylized, and very modern look. We see an opportunity here to make it fit with the Victorian era better. This can definitely be an area where immersion is enriched and, of course, strengthen our art pillars. We took inspiration from newspaper illustrations and blueprint illustrations of the Victorian era and adopted it for our infographics. And as icing on the cake, we overlaid the drawings on top of aged paper background. It looks really good. That's it. That ends this Dev Diary. Next week, content design lead will talk about journal entries. Don't know how interesting that's going to be, but we'll kind of wait for that. I do like this. This looks good. Tutorial is a major bugbear for me. I feel that a lot of strategy games fall dramatically short in the tutorial, and Paradox is no different. They are not immune to this. A lot of their game tutorials are honestly not good at all, which is great for people like me on YouTube who do guide videos on how the game mechanics work. If the company did a better job in describing how a game worked then in a tutorial, then I think, obviously that would leave less content for us to do on YouTube. But at the end of the day, I don't really care about the latter. I would prefer a game to have a very complete tutorial, even if the tutorial takes you 30 minutes to an hour to complete, to really understand not just where the buttons are and, hey, you can move, granted, you don't move units in this game, but you'd move unit A to point B. Okay, you right click or whatever, that's fine. But what does it mean? What is the meaning behind these mechanics? I think that's one area the tutorials completely fall apart for me in most strategy games. Not all of them, but in a lot of them. So there you have it, an overview of the UI design. In my opinion, it looks okay. We'll just have to wait and see what it looks like on screen. Let me know your thoughts again, how important UI and UX design are for you, how forgiving you are dependent on the overall mechanics of a game. Until next time, I'm Realm Builder Guy, and I will talk to you soon.